You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Past Macabre, where together we journey through history to uncover how our relationship with death reflects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way people live. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice. Thank you for joining me for episode 24, Sunken Cities Part 3, Thonis-Heracleion, the City of Commerce and Ceremony. Thonis-Heracleion was recently discovered in the year 2000, so in the grand scheme of archaeological sites, it's fairly new. After years of comparing ancient texts and archaeological evidence that existed at the time, local rumors, and state-of-the-art geophysical studies to try to identify the location, researchers finally found it after quite a lot of effort. It's the archaeological site that made me personally invested in the actual scientific method behind being an Egyptologist instead of just romanticizing the broad concept of how fun it would be to study ancient Egypt. So I am very, very personally excited to talk about it in this episode. Honestly, there was a Discovery Channel documentary in about 2003 that made me want to not only become an Egyptologist and pretty much solidified that dream for me, but it's also the reason that I got scuba certified. I hoped that one day I would get to dive in Egypt, specifically also so that I could see Thonis-Heracleion someday. I don't think it's actually open to the public for divers, but maybe someday it might be cool if it would be open for everyone to go and visit. But for now, we're going to take a look at all of the artifacts and the research that has been done there and everything that can be shared with the public. Honestly, this is why I advocate for public outreach. I would have never really fallen so much in love with archaeology if it hadn't been for a documentary about the discovery of this site. So I will always be advocating for public outreach in order to inspire more and more archaeologists. And honestly, Thonis-Heracleion inspired quite a lot of who I am as an archaeologist today, now that I think about it for this episode. Studying Thonis-Heracleion is important to the grand scheme of things and not just my personal interests, because it's very hard to find any preserved archaeological evidence in the Nile Delta. So we don't have as much information about what life was like in the Delta compared to what we have about Upper Egypt. And the past 25 years of excavations here at Thonis-Heracleion and the research that follows up with all of the artifacts, they've taught us so much about the city beyond just the small pieces of info that have been left by ancient writers and then small depictions of life in the Delta. So in this episode, I'll share some of what we've learned so far about the sacred temples and the bustling trade and all of the deities who watched over the entrance to the Nile at this sacred port of major commerce, Thonis-Heracleion. Now let's get started. Thonis-Heracleion was known by the ancient Egyptian name Ta-Honisais, or roughly the entrance to the waterways of Sais. And Sais was the city in the Delta that was the capital of Egypt during the 24th and 26th dynasties. So this tie to those dynasties also gives us a bit of a clue of when what we now call Thonis-Heracleion was established. Heracleion was the Greek name for the city because Khonsu was worshipped there, and they associated him with Heracles. We'll get more into that in a bit. Ancient sources never used both names for the city, only one or the other, so it was always assumed that Thonis-Heracleion were two different cities until the site was rediscovered. When it was, archaeologists found a trilingual stela called the Declaration of Sais that names the city as Heracleion in the Greek text, but Thonis in the hieroglyphics. The city once stood about 4.5 kilometers or just under 3 miles to the east of Canopus. The destruction of Thonis-Heracleion was pretty much the same as Canopus because of their proximity, so be sure to listen to episode 22 for the details. This episode is about when Thonis-Heracleion was flourishing, which was about the 6th to the 2nd centuries BCE. Thanks to the declaration of Sais and the artifacts that have been found here so far, we know that this was where merchant ships stopped to pay their taxes before their goods could enter Egypt. Anyone who came across the Mediterranean, not just the Greeks, all of the trade through the Mediterranean stopped here. So for the artifact examples, we have lots of different trade weights that were found, and those are pieces of metal that are used on balance scales that were a specific standardized weight so that the merchants or tax collectors could use them whenever weighing goods to determine their price fairly quickly instead of having a much more difficult and complex process. Most of these weights were examples of Egyptian weights, which are seen at other Egyptian port cities and marketplaces, etc. And this was standardized across all of Egypt during its periods when it was united. But there were also some examples that were Attic or Athenian weights. The name's interchangeable. It just means that they were from Athens. And in Greece, each major city-state had its own standards as far as the weight of goods and their coinage went. And so this is actually very interesting because this is the first example of Attic weights that were found in Egypt. In addition to trade goods, mercenaries would also come to Thonis-Heracleion, which was a very big quote-unquote industry during this period. And there's lots of evidence that they were used all throughout the region, but also within Egypt. So they weren't just there to protect the Greek merchants. They were also going to be hired by the Egyptians, and sometimes the Ptolemies would even hire them for civil wars amongst each other. So quite a big industry, as I said. And so therefore, they would be also coming in, as well as all of the boats full of trade goods. So again, just to reiterate, a lot of traffic coming through Thonis-Heracleion. There have been burials found with artifacts that show that there were quite a lot of Greek mercenaries who lived here. But again, not just here as traders, and they weren't just buried here in constant mass graves of a single battle that happened here. So that goes to show that there was a life for the mercenaries here, and instead of being sent all the way back to their homelands, some were buried here, either because this was their home or this was the closest they could get to their homelands. But it was still an intentional choice, and a lot of the grave goods that were found there are very fine. So it's not really like there were paupers' graves kind of situations happening. There were also coins specifically made for paying Greek mercenaries minted here. They were made to look similar as coins from Athens, so they had Athena's owl on one side and her face on the other. Since this was before Egypt began minting its own currency and they didn't have their own coin designs, it makes sense that they would kind of default to the homeland of the mercenaries they were hiring. And we know that they minted them here and not just had a bunch of these coins because archaeologists found a die or a stamp for casting the coins, and it still works. I'll share some images on social media of it's still in such a good condition. When it's pressed down on clay, it still makes the imprint that it would have made on the coin. It's very cool. From Thonis-Heracleion, mercenaries and trade goods alike would either go to Canopus and then further down the Nile, or they would go to the Greek Emporion Naucratis, or Naucratis, and that was an entirely Greek settlement established during the late period to strengthen trade relations with Greece and Egypt, and also to serve as a place for the Greek mercenaries to live when they were needed further inland. And an emporion is a large market city, and Naucratis was huge. So again, all of this is just to reiterate the size of Thonis-Heracleion, because if Naucratis was already recognized by many ancient writers as a massive trade hub, and all of the trade goods are going to there, plus going to Canopus for further down the Nile, again, lots of activity. Just want to make sure that that's very clear. It was quite a bustling trade hub. So far, more than 700 ancient anchors have been discovered and 125 shipwrecks. They date from the 6th to the 2nd century BCE, and that is just a small snapshot of how busy Thonis would have been at its peak. I know I've said this many times, but again, that's huge. And considering those shipwrecks did span a large period of time and they weren't all sunk at once in some sort of very large cataclysmic event, that again goes to show you how much of the area was perfectly navigable even with the shipwrecks waiting. The actual landmass of the city of Thonis-Heracleion was spread across multiple islands within the delta, and there were docks and anchorages all over to accommodate the merchant ships that were coming in and going out to sea, as well as the boats that people would have used to move between the islands as they went about their daily lives. And then there would also be goods going on smaller boats to a little bit more local transports in the mix with all of that. The archaeological record shows that trade at Thonis-Heracleion sharply declined after Alexandria was established as the main port in 331 BCE. There was still some activity going through to move stuff to Naucratis, but pretty much everything had been already moved over to be transported through Alexandria, which was meant to be the new face of Egypt in the Mediterranean. So like Canopus in the previous episode, Thonis-Heracleion had to make changes in order to survive. As the Ptolemaic period went on following the establishment of Alexandria, artisans at Thonis began producing their own goods on a much larger scale than they ever had before based on the archaeological record that's been found so far, especially when it came to pottery. Most of the pottery that was previously found for like earlier eras were mainly imported or super basic utilitarian stuff. It might have been identified as a local production, but during the Ptolemaic period, artisans were making things both for domestic shipping down into Egypt and then also shipping across the wider Mediterranean trade network. It will be very interesting to see if any other workshops start to come up in prominence from that same period. But like I said, so far, especially pottery has been identified. And there's also quite a few boats and sacred activities that are still dating to the period after Alexandria started, which shows us that Thonis-Heracleion was able to continue on. With economic importance came religious importance in pretty much every site in ancient Egypt's history, and there were many deities worshipped here. According to the Declaration of Sais, 10% of taxes collected went to the temples of the goddess Nate of Sais. Nate was one of the primary goddesses during the 26th dynasty, and her primary cult center was at Sais, the capital. Her worship actually goes much farther back, but she really gained prominence during this period and was considered the mother of the pharaoh during this time. So far, no temple dedicated to her specifically has been found at Thonis, but a bronze helmet was found that belonged to a colossal statue of Athena, and she was pretty often syncretized with Nate during the Ptolemaic period. So chances are that if we are able to find the rest of this statue in future excavations, that we'll hopefully be able to identify a syncretized version of Athena Nate. A colossal statue of Hapi, the god of the Nile, stood over the place where ships transitioned from the salty seawater to the fresh water of the Nile. There's evidence of walls that were created to make 5 narrow channels within that mouth that leads to the Canopic Gate, or the mouth into the Nile, and that channel actually had locks in it, essentially like mini dams, little gateways that would limit movement into the Nile as ships that could handle the shallower waters would make the transfer from the sea to the fresh water of the Nile, and the locks could be used to control the levels of the water in order to get those ships a better and smoother transition. Hapi wasn't worshipped in temples, though pretty much anywhere in Egypt. Being the god of the Nile, he was worshipped generally as the Nile. But there are lots of temples around Thonis-Heracleion. It is interesting, though, the functionality that these deities have. Nate is associated with taxes, and Hapi is also associated with controlling the Nile in order to move ships for trade. And as far as temple worship goes, Khonsu was originally the most prominent deity at Thonis-Heracleion. He's the god of travelers and healing and time, the moon, protection against evil. He can do exorcisms. He was called the slayer of enemies and the butcher of the gods during the Old Kingdom. And he was the greatest god of the great gods during the 19th Dynasty. Honestly, I could keep going on about Khonsu. He deserves his own episode once I get back to the Gods and Goddesses of Death series that I had started previously. But back to Thonis-Heracleion. Here, as far as temples go, one of the oldest temples that's here and identified so far is the Temple of Khonsu Thoth, or Khonsu Thoth, depending on your pronunciation of the god of wisdom and writing and justice. The dates for this temple were built during the reign of Amasis, so it dates to about 570 to 526 BCE. This was during the 26th dynasty, so as the oldest temple identified here, and given the name of the site, it is heavily leaning towards that the majority of Thonis-Heracleion grew during the 26th dynasty and then onward. And if there was earlier activity here, it wasn't as prominent during that time. Now, Khonsu Thoth was a syncretic mix, especially focused on Khonsu's protection from evil and Thoth's aspect as a god of justice. And the temple was actually placed at the entrance of the Canopic branch, so it was symbolically guarding the entrance to the Nile from anyone who would wish to do harm. It was in use until 526 to 525 BCE, which coincides with the invasion of the Achaemenid Empire and the end of the 26th dynasty. There was a lot of upheaval in general, so it could have been iconoclasm, that this temple was destroyed. It could have been that already the shifting Nile sands of the delta were becoming a problem for it. But either way, the temple did not last beyond that period. Nearby the temple ruins, 13 sarcophagi belonging to sacred birds of Khonsu Thoth were found. The mummies themselves, unfortunately, along with much of the rest of the temple, seem to have been looted before this portion of the city sank. So we don't know for sure which birds that they were. Both Khonsu and Thoth were associated with falcons, so those would have been obvious, but also Thoth's association with ibises did carry over to Khonsu whenever they were syncretized. So it could have been either falcons, or it could have been ibises, or it could have been both. There was also a temple of Heracles, who was a syncretized form of Khonsu, honored as the child of Amun, and often associated with both Heracles and Horus, since they were sons of powerful gods as well. And he was very often depicted as either Khonsu Pak Herod or Khonsu the Child when he was associated with Heracles, or he was depicted in his more warrior defender aspects. At the site, underneath the foundation of the temple of Khonsu Heracles, or Hercules as we call him in modern times for anyone who watched Disney, the foundation deposit had a statue of Khonsu Pak Herod, Khonsu the Child, and it was meant to represent the beginning of the lunar cycle, the beginning of the agricultural cycle. So very fitting with the whole god Hapi being here, the fertility of the delta. It all definitely fits in with the entire atmosphere of the region. And with this deposit of the little statue, there was also a wooden naus scaled to its size. So the naus is the little shrines that, this is a little shrine. Normally they're about 5 to 6 feet tall, and they're massive stone shrines normally, and they house the statues of the gods. So this was an interesting foundation deposit to bless this place as the temple was being built. It's actually not very common in many foundation deposits to see actual statues of deities. Normally, you're going to have like depictions of tools, not functional tools, but like models of tools or amulets and things like that that represent different deities, but the actual figurines of deities is a little more rare. According to Herodotus in Histories, which he wrote in the 5th century BCE, this temple to Khonsu Heracles was built on the very place that Heracles first set foot in Egypt. And he also said that it was a place of asylum for anyone who needed it, especially for slaves who escaped. According to him, when Paris was trying to kidnap Helen, he actually had to stop here in Egypt. And while he stopped to deal with some things, either dealing with weather or resupplying, his slaves ran away to the temple and they gained their freedom this way. And essentially it was a big thorn in Paris's side trying to get Helen back to Troy. There seems to be a little bit of truth that this myth would have been based in, because 300 years later, Ptolemy VIII ordered the right to asylum would be reinstated here. It was preserved on the Amnesty Decree, which is a colossal stela that was raised in Thonis-Heracleion. And even though theologically every temple and sanctuary could offer refuge in the Greek world, only a few locations had the legally recognized right to offer asylum from civil authorities, such as any escaped slaves who needed a place to stay that wouldn't allow them to be just arrested and brought back. The Amnesty Decree goes on to grant amnesty for quite a lot of things because it was in the wake of a very messy civil war, but it is interesting to see that continued presence of amnesty here at this sanctuary. Osiris was also worshipped here. As I mentioned in the previous episode about Canopus, the Osirian Mysteries involved both Canopus and Thonis-Heracleion. The sacred barge that was part of the festivities carried the statue of Osiris from the temple of Amun-Gareb, the sun god and the god of kingship during this period, and it went through this special canal that connected the temple of Amun-Gareb to the temple of Osiris that was in Canopus. This procession symbolized the annual agricultural cycles, and it was held near the winter solstice during the last month of the Nile inundation period and just before planting season. They have found the barge that was used during these ceremonies, or at least one. They probably had to replace them every now and then. But they found one of the barges. It was made of sycamore, which was a very sacred wood to ancient Egyptians. And this was made in a way so that it was carrying the statue of Osiris between the two temples. And then there were also offerings found all around the boat. Likely they had been on the boat originally, and then as the boat sank, they settled as well nearby. Around the boat and along the canal where the procession took place, in addition to those lead model boats that I mentioned in the previous episode, there were over 100 bronze sympula, which are ritual ladles that have been found. And that's more in this one location that have been found across all of Egypt during the Ptolemaic period. So this is, during all of the periods, but during the Ptolemaic period is when these were really used the most. And the majority of the ones that were found here all ended in a duck head, which was connected to the agricultural celebrations and was often associated with abundance. Ducks were a main source of food in ancient Egypt and also a sign of a healthy ecosystem for the Nile. So they represent abundance and health. These elongated duck-shaped ladles would have been used during rituals for pouring libations or holding scented oils or placing specific types of offerings that would normally get your hands very dirty into wherever the offerings were meant to go. We know that they were used in the Mysteries of Osiris because parts of the mysteries were depicted at Dendera Temple as well. This wasn't something that was only celebrated here at Thonis-Heracleion and Canopus. There at Dendera, there's a depiction that shows a simpulum, which is, again, these ladles, being used to pour a measure of earth that's been soaked in water from the holy lake there into different vessels that were used during different parts of the ritual period. So likely similar things happened here, and also there have been evidence of previous use cases where these ladles were used to hold the remains of charred animal sacrifices, for example. So these sorts of things would have been used to pour any of the offerings into the canal as a procession took place. And a lot of them show that they were intentionally damaged through twisting and breaking and trying to make them unusable on purpose before they were then deposited into the water. This is something with votive offerings that is very common because it makes sure that nobody's going to come behind you and try to steal the thing or reuse the thing in any way. This shows that this object was only used and made for this specific purpose. Or at the very least, if it wasn't originally made for it, it has now fulfilled all of its life's purpose and is now going as a votive offering into the ocean. Archaeologists have also found a massive granite Osiris bed, or a really large gardening tub that was used in the Mysteries of Osiris. A figure would have been made out of the fertile soil from the delta and grain seeds, and this represented Osiris when he died. Over the full month, sacred water would be ceremoniously poured over the grain mummy, possibly even using some of those ceremonial ladles. And over time, the seeds would start to sprout, and then the entire mummy would become growing, sprouting with life, all green and ready to start the rebirth cycle, as Osiris did when he was pieced back together and reborn according to the Osirian myth. There's also evidence of a potential sanctuary dedicated to Osiris, just a small pier almost, where similar offerings would have been concentrated based on a lot of the finds that have been found in that area. It's a highly concentrated amount of Osiris statues, but more research has to be done to confirm what sort of sacred space that was intended to be. The Temple of Amun-Gereb at Thonis-Heracleion is the largest of all of the temples. Amun became more important to the area than Khonsu was, and generally overall during this period, he was seen as the god who bestowed kingship. And the Ptolemies took that sort of imagery very, very seriously in order to legitimize their rule in the eyes of the native Egyptians. New pharaohs would celebrate the rite of dynastic continuity, and Amun-Gereb would then legitimize their rule after they performed that rite here, dedicated to him. It was built between 450 to 380 BCE, and it continued to be used as a centerpiece of the city up until it was destroyed during a soil liquefaction event that happened during an earthquake around 150 to 100 BCE. But luckily for us, that liquefaction event is actually what's preserved the site so well. There's actually wooden posts within the temple that are still so well preserved. You can see with the naked eye the stress fractures that were caused during the earthquake on the pillars. And there's papyrus matting that's been preserved in incredibly well quality preservation states. I cannot geek out about this enough, but it's truly amazing considering we don't often get these levels of preservation within any sort of area where there is water. Even with other underwater archaeology sites where there is some preservation, it's not to this level of pristine. When this earthquake happened and the liquefaction event happened, this massive temple, which was built with huge, heavy stones, came crumbling down very quickly. And there were several ships that were anchored close to it because it was essentially right up to the water with the way that it was built on the central island. And there were several ships that were pinned down to the ocean floor with the stones and debris from the temple collapsing, and they have been preserved in an incredibly great state of preservation as well, thanks to that. As I mentioned before, the city had quite a lot of Greek merchants and mercenaries coming through and living here as well, so there were also Greek deities. It wasn't all about keeping up appearances for just the Egyptians. The Ptolemies didn't want to alienate their Greek brethren either. And so there have been specific examples of both Greek only architecture as in comparison to the combination Ptolemaic architecture that was at a lot of the other places. And most of the statues and iconography found throughout Thonis-Heracleion is Egyptian, but there is a sanctuary to Aphrodite that has been found here with a lot of very high quality imported Greek goods. And one example is a very high quality duck libation jar that would have been used during rituals here. Waterfowl were associated with Aphrodite. Ducks are very commonly associated with any deities associated with abundance, life, fertility, and love in the case of Aphrodite, because also of her origin myth where she was created of sea foam. Her sanctuary here is a tholos, which is a type of circular temple that's built with 2 or more rings of columns. A statue of Aphrodite was found near the center of the tholos, and it is a masterpiece. Literally, it was created by the best sculptor in the 4th century BCE in the entire region. His name is Praxiteles, which he was pretty famous for his sculptures of goddesses specifically. The level of expense that went into this item shows that this sanctuary would have been very, very important to any of the traveling Greeks who were coming here, and especially because Aphrodite was often associated with the sea and protection at sea. It'll be interesting to see what else is uncovered as more and more of the site is revealed. Every single year, the excavations reveal even more than we knew before, and it's amazing. I personally can't wait until they're able to identify a lot of the statues that were lifted during the entire mission that happened back at the end of August to lift the statues out of Canopus, and there will be a lot more research done with the smaller artifacts that have been lifted from this most recent excavation season at Thonis-Heracleion. So obviously, I will keep everybody aligned on any updates that come if I can make an episode out of it, because I absolutely love Thonis-Heracleion. It inspired me, and I am always going to love just geeking out about this site and sharing it with all of you. So thanks for joining me for this look at my favorite sunken city. The next sunken city I'll be sharing is now called Pueblo Grande de Nevada, and as the name implies, it's in Nevada in the U.S. It's now beneath Lake Mead, the U.S.'s largest reservoir and one of its most notoriously haunted, so perfect for October. But from about 300 to 1150 CE, it was a thriving city built by the ancestral Puebloans. On Saturday, October 18th, I'll be doing a live stream from the Lost City Museum that was built around the excavation site of one of the pueblos, and it houses the artifacts that were recovered before the majority of the city was flooded. It showcases both the ancestral Puebloan culture and has preserved the different stages of an archaeological excavation to educate the public on the process. I'll be joined by Virginia Lucas, the archaeologist on site at the museum, to chat about the city and artifacts. It'll be Saturday, October 18th at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time. So make sure to join me. I'll be sure to post the link on social media leading up to it. Until next time. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the past macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.